Oh shoot, I
What?
just lost our engine.
I didn't hear anything.
Exactly. But don't worry, I know what to do. I watched a free pilot training video on this.
Oh, that's good. We'll be fine.
Welcome to Free Pilot Training. I'm Josh and this is Aaron. And in this video, we're going to talk to you about what you should do if you lose your engine in a single engine aircraft. I know. Losing an engine sounds super scary, especially if you only have one of them. But I think you're going to be surprised at how many pilots that have actually survived when their engine took a dump on them. And that's because we're actually required to learn about how to deal with situations just like this.
The FAA requires pilots to learn how to deal with the loss of an engine for two reasons. First, if you just have a basic understanding of the engine and the engine systems, a lot of times you might actually be able to restart the engine. Second, if you can't get the engine restarted, we want you to be able to land the airplane without an engine. Hold up for a second. I can see that some of you have a worried look on your face right now, and that's okay. But the most important thing for you to remember is that it's totally possible to land without an engine. People do it all the time. I don't want to say that it's no big deal, but the airplane will literally fly all the way down to the scene of the crash. I'm just kidding. The airplane will handle and land just fine without an engine. You just need to maintain control of the aircraft, and that's the key to surviving any emergency. In fact, the Air Force teaches their pilots a 4-step process for every emergency. They call it MATL, and before their pilots are allowed to do any troubleshooting, the Air Force pounds it into their brain that flying the aircraft is the priority throughout the entire emergency. And there's a reason for this. Sometimes you will not have the brain bites to troubleshoot a problem. One example of this is if you were to lose an engine on takeoff. This would be what we call a critical phase of flight, and if you don't prioritize landing the airplane, you will most likely crash because you're fiddling around with other stuff just trying to get the engine restarted.
So, for every emergency, I want you to remember that maintaining aircraft control is always the priority. And when we do start trying to get the engine restarted, the first thing we want to do is to maintain control of the aircraft, and then we'll start troubleshooting from there.
I know I'm going to catch some heat for this, but when it comes to emergencies, I believe that pilots should memorize the first couple steps of the checklist. This is the way the Air Force taught me, and if you want to prioritize controlling the airplane like we just talked about, those first couple steps need to be muscle memory so you can maintain control of the airplane without fiddling for a checklist. This is why most instructors teach the ABCs for situations where you lose your engine. This gives you a systematic way of handling the emergency so you can maintain control and move through the checklist quickly, because time is of the essence when you lose your engine in a single engine aircraft, especially if you're flying a Piper Cherokee that has the glide ratio of a potato. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you how I go through the ABCs during an engine out scenario, but you're not going to get a complete understanding of what we're trying to accomplish if I don't break down these steps one by one. So before we do that, let's take a closer look at the ABCs of losing an engine. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. What to do if you lose an engine with me. You're welcome for that, by the way. Now, when you look at these ABCs, I hope you notice something right away here. These first two steps are literally to remind you to get the aircraft under control and start heading towards a good landing spot.
Okay, but what does airspeed and best landing spot have to do with maintaining aircraft control?
I'm so glad you asked that. Let's start with the A in our ABCs. This A stands for airspeed. The first thing you want to do is to pitch for a specific airspeed. And that airspeed we want to pitch for is best glide, not your landing speed. Best glide is a very special airspeed because when you fly at that exact airspeed, your airplane is going to have the least amount of drag possible on it. This means that if you pitch for best glide, you will glide the longest distance possible. This is important because if you fly any slower or faster, you may not be able to make it to that nice soft field you're shooting for. You may have to settle for those trees instead, and I don't particularly want to land in trees. Do you? Now, take a look at this chart in the POH for my Cessna 172H. Notice that Cessna says that if I fly 80 miles per hour or 70 knots, I can expect to glide these distances you see here on this chart. Once again, if we fly above or below these speeds, they ain't guaranteeing nothing. Keep this in mind. This speed is going to be different in every airplane you fly. In fact, a lot of Cessna 172s have a best glide closer to 65 knots, not 80 miles per hour, so be sure to check your POH and memorize the correct speed for your airplane. In addition to that, there's a few other things you should keep in mind. First, this chart was made with a windmilling propeller. A windmilling prop simply means that the engine isn't running, but the air is pushing on the propeller and causing it to turn. Now, we're going to talk more about this in a minute, but this is really important because if your engine is frozen up for some reason, your prop may not be able to turn. This is about a hint and a half that you're probably not going to be able to restart the engine. But in addition to that, it's going to keep you from gliding as far as well because that stuck prop creates a ton of drag. Now, Cessna won't tell you how much it'll change your glide distance, and I really don't think you need to dig around and find those numbers, but it's definitely something you want to keep in mind. Something else you need to keep in mind is that this chart and most charts like it are also made with flaps up and zero wind. This is why you should be very careful about lowering the flaps too early during an emergency. The truth is, a lot of times you don't even need them, but if you lower the flaps too early, that could keep you from making it to your landing spot. The wind is also an important consideration. A tailwind will increase your gliding distance, and that's because it increases your ground speed. And the stronger the tailwind, the more distance you're going to be able to travel as you glide towards your landing spot. If you're dealing with a tailwind and it's going to cause you to glide past where you intend to touch down, this is where you might want to consider using flaps or a forward slip to keep you from going past your intended touchdown spot. A headwind, on the other hand, will decrease your glide distance. So once again, if you're not paying attention, this could keep you from making it to your landing spot. So once again, be careful with flaps and really make sure that you're nailing that best glide speed. And don't forget, if you don't focus on that airspeed, that can mean the difference in landing on soft grass or running right into a tree.
Watch out for that tree! Watch out for that tree!
Okay, so A is for airspeed. You got to make sure that you're flying best glide. This is going to allow you to glide as far as possible. Then B stands for best landing spot.
Pick out the best landing spot in that area. Now, for some reason, student pilots always struggle with this. Don't spend forever looking for a spot to land, but pick a spot that you know for sure you can make it to without your engine. And I'm not sure why I have to say this, but if there's a runway within gliding distance, and you can definitely make it, why would you pick some random cornfield instead of landing on a nice smooth runway? I know it sounds crazy, but I see this all the time. Now, there are going to be times when it looks like there are no good spots to land. You may find this hard to believe, but people survive tree landings and water landings all the time. Those aren't my first choice, but there are some tricks you can use to make those types of landings more survivable. Anyway, if I don't have a nice smooth runway below me, my first choice is typically a nice long field. Now, I'm not a huge fan of landing on roads. I know a lot of instructors teach their students to land on roads in between the traffic, but it's not really the traffic that bothers me. I don't like the fact that most roads have power lines running beside and across them, and they're almost impossible to see until your airplane gets cut in half. And landing two airplanes can be pretty difficult. Okay, so we need to pick the best landing spot. Now, there are a ton of instructors out there who would say, pick the best landing spot and stick to it. I don't really agree with this. I think it's stupid if you're gliding towards a spot and then you realize that you're definitely not going to make it, but you keep going anyway when you see that there is a spot that you can make it to, but then you kill yourself because your instructor told you to stick with your first choice. My recommendation is that you pick a spot and do your best to make it work, but don't be afraid to take advantage of a better landing spot. That being said, when you first start practicing emergency descents, try your best to stick with your first choice. This is important because you need to start learning how to judge your gliding distance. Now, there are a few different techniques that can help you determine where your aircraft is going to touch down during a power-off approach. But I've found that your touchdown spot is typically the only spot on the ground that doesn't seem to move as your airplane glides towards the surface. Some instructors will tell you that that spot appears to be less blurry as well when you look at it, but I honestly have never noticed that. Anyway, it's important to develop a feel for your aircraft's vector during a power-off approach. And this is going to really help you if you need to land the airplane in a good spot during an emergency. So, when you first start practicing engine out scenarios, don't change up your landing spot, but don't be afraid to pick something better during a real emergency. That being said, changing your mind too much can be dangerous as well. We've all seen the squirrel who gets ran over because he couldn't make up his mind when a vehicle comes. Don't be a squirrel. My recommendation is that if you see a better landing spot, land there instead, but don't change your landing spot more than one time.
Now for the million-dollar question. When should we go around when we're practicing emergency descents?
Now, I know that there are some schools out there that have strict rules that don't allow their students to descend below 500 feet AGL when they're practicing these maneuvers, and we obviously don't want to break any of the rules from FAR 91-119. But I honestly don't think you can fully develop your emergency approach and landing skills if you go around at 500 feet above the ground every time you practice. Let me show you something really quick. These are the Airman Certification Standards, and on your check ride, this is the document that the evaluator is going to use to grade you. Now, show me on this document where it says that you need to go around at 500 feet AGL. Yeah, it's not on there. It does say that you need to use good risk management during low altitude maneuvering and avoid controlled flight into terrain, but they do not give you a minimum altitude where you should go around. Keep in mind, you do have to use good risk management when it comes to collision hazards. What's the terrain look like in that area? Are there any obstacles or wires I should be concerned about? If I go around at 100 feet AGL, am I going to be able to climb out safely without running into something? Don't take things for granted just because you live in Kansas and there's no terrain or obstacles in that area where you practice these maneuvers. You never know when you might go around after one of these and see... Okay, maybe not. But use good judgment when you fly close to the ground. But if you never descend below 500 feet, you're going to miss out on some really important practice when it comes to emergency descents. This practice can really help you develop your skills and confidence so that if you do lose an engine, you know for sure that you're going to make your landing spot. That being said, there are going to be instructors that disagree with me, and that's fine. If your instructor won't let you go below 500 feet AGL, see if he'll let you practice a few emergency descents to a runway instead. This will allow you to see what you need to do to hit that landing spot if you ever need that skill and you don't have power to help you do that.
Okay, let's do a quick review. A is for airspeed, pitch for best glide, and then B is for best landing spot. But what if we lose our engine right after takeoff and there's not enough runway in front of us? Now what?
Keep in mind, there are going to be times when you could lose your engine, but the first two steps are all you have time for. That's fine. Just land the airplane. In fact, if you do lose your engine right after takeoff and there's not enough runway in front of you, the FAA wants you to just land straight ahead. Now, I'll come back to that in just a second, but first I want to say something to each and every pilot here. If you forget everything else I'm about to say, but you prioritize landing the airplane in a safe spot during an emergency, you are way more likely to survive an engine out scenario than if you're fiddling around with the fuel mixture or something else and trying to land at the same time. And let me tell you something else. You are completely within your rights as the pilot in command if you decide that landing the airplane is the only thing you have time for. For our 91.3 paragraph B says that in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. If you haven't seen the movie Sully, you really need to watch it. Everyone there, including ATC, was telling him to turn around and land on the airport. But he decided that the only place he could safely land was in the Hudson. In that moment, only he and his co-pilot knew what was actually happening. And the same thing goes for you if you ever experience an emergency. Landing safely should always be your first priority. And if you have time, then do this other stuff.
But if we lose the engine on takeoff, should we land straight ahead or should we turn back to the runway? This is a really important discussion that you should have with your instructor. But let's talk about a few things that I think you should consider.
If you lose an engine on takeoff and there's not enough runway in front of you, at what altitude should you consider turning around and landing on the runway behind you? Now, a good instructor is going to say that depends, and I would agree with that. You need to be 100% sure that you can make it back, because if you're not, it's way safer to just land straight ahead. But this is not something you want to think about after you've lost the engine. This is something that you want to consider and think through before you even take off, because this decision is going to be different for every pilot. New pilots with very little experience are going to need a lot more altitude in order to make it back to the runway because they haven't fully developed those skills yet. Dan Grider apparently also needs a lot more altitude in order to safely make it back. I'm just kidding, but if he can deal it out, surely he can take it. Anyway, you need to consider your skill level if you want to be certain that turning around is the right choice. But you also need to consider the aircraft that you're flying. I've practiced this maneuver in a few different aircraft, and I've successfully made the impossible turn at 400 feet above the ground in a Cessna 172. But when I've tried it in a Piper Cherokee, it's been closer to 600 feet AGL. Now, I know that some of this has to do with the runway length and climb rate, but there are a few things you can do to help you determine how much altitude you need if you want to be sure that you can make it back. Now, I don't think it's very safe for new student pilots to practice this to an actual runway. So what you can do is you can climb up to a safe altitude, chop the power, and then turn around 180 degrees while trying to lose as little altitude as possible. Remember, the faster you can capture best glide, the less altitude you're going to lose.
Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to see what would happen if we took off and we lost our engine on takeoff and I tried to turn back to the runway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get on a northbound heading here, and as soon as I lose my power, so I'm going to pull power to idle, I'm going to see how much altitude I lose to get to a southbound heading. So let's go ahead and reslay real quick because I haven't done that in a few minutes here. And then we'll get going. Okay, so that looks better. So let me start out with a good altitude. So I'll start out at 3,000 feet, and then we'll simulate that we lost our engine on takeoff. And it's important to get back to our airspeed of 70 knots as quickly as possible so we can glide as far as possible. Okay, we just took off. We lost our engine. Pitching for 70 as soon as possible. Getting a little slow. I'll start the turn, but I'm going to start pitching for 70. I want to make sure I'm staying coordinated to create as little as drag as possible. Flying at 70 knots here. We'll see how much altitude we lose. Getting a little slow, correcting. There, we've already lost 200 feet. Getting close, I've already lost 300. And there's a southbound heading. We lost somewhere around 350 feet during this maneuver, so let's call it 400 feet. So 400 feet is what I can roughly expect to lose anytime I take off and I want to turn back to the runway.
Keep in mind, if I lost 400 feet during my maneuver, 400 feet AGL is probably not the best altitude to use. That would mean that I would need to turn back to the runway the exact second I lost my engine. Let's be realistic. It might take a few seconds before some of us realize that we need to make a decision. There might even be a couple of you guys who need a few minutes. But anyway, the Air Force actually used to teach something called the 6-second rule. It takes 2 seconds for a pilot to realize there's a problem, then it takes 2 seconds for the pilot to make a decision, and it takes 2 more seconds to actually do something about it. This means that for 6 seconds we were trucking out away from the runway before we even did anything. That means that we could be 600 more feet away from the runway or more if you're in a faster aircraft. So if we pull out our glide chart and we do a little bit of math, we could determine that we really need to add about 60 more feet of altitude to account for our slow reaction time. Let's call it 100 more feet to be safe. Now, there's one more thing we need to account for. What happens if we're climbing out from the runway and we turn 180 degrees to the left? Where would that put us? That's right, it would put us over here to the right of center line. Because of that, we need to add a little bit more altitude so we can get ourselves aligned on final. Now, there are a few different ways you can do the math for this, but I just recommend adding 200 feet to account for that. That's more than enough. So, if I lost 400 feet during my 180 degree turn, and I add 100 feet to account for my reaction time, and another 200 feet so I can get aligned on final, then I know for sure that I can make the runway if I turn around at 700 feet AGL. So, if my elevation is 249 feet at my takeoff field, then I know that if I lose my engine below 949 feet MSL, I need to plan on landing straight ahead. In fact, let's call it 1,000 feet MSL to be safe, and if I come up with a plan like this for every takeoff, that makes it a lot easier to make a decision if that time ever comes.
Okay, so if A is for airspeed and B is for best landing spot, what is C for?
Yeah, that's right. C4 is a plastic explosive. I'm sorry, I can't pass up a good dad joke. C stands for checklist, and this is specifically referring to the emergency start checklist. Now, sometimes you'll hear me say carb heat and then checklist because you may be having engine trouble because of carb icing. And it's super important to get that carb heat on as soon as possible if there really is carburetor icing. But this doesn't mess up our ABCs one bit because carb heat also starts with the letter C, in case you didn't notice. Okay, here's a look at the emergency start checklist that I like to use in my Cessna 172H. Keep in mind that the checklist in other aircraft is going to be slightly different than this checklist you see here. For example, low-wing aircraft like this Piper Cherokee have an additional fuel pump that should be turned on if you lose your engine, because the engine-driven fuel pump could be the cause of the engine failure. High-wing aircraft like my Cessna are able to feed the engine by gravity, so if it had a fuel pump that went out, my engine's still going to run, and that's the whole point in this checklist. We're basically trying everything we can to get the engine restarted. But I want you to notice something here. Where in this checklist does it say engine restart? Nope, there's not a mistake here. It doesn't exist. If your propeller is windmilling and you fix one of these problems in this checklist, the engine will restart on its own, as long as there's nothing else wrong with the engine. Remember what we said earlier? A windmilling propeller is when the air is pushing the propeller and causing it to turn. Let's say I had a kid with me in the front seat of my aircraft, and he reached down and turned off my fuel selector valve. What do you think is going to happen to my engine? Yep, it's going to run out of fuel and the engine's going to die. But when I run my emergency start checklist and I turn it back on because that's one of the steps, I don't need to engage the starter to get the engine running again because there's nothing actually wrong with the engine. It should start back up on its own as long as the propeller is windmilling. 9 times out of 10, if there's nothing wrong with your engine, the prop is going to be windmilling if your engine quits running for some reason. So, if the engine is frozen up, there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to start it back up anyway. And a lot of people would say that you shouldn't even try to start it back up if the engine isn't turning, because you could make the problem worse and cause an engine fire or something like that. And believe me, an engine fire is worse than losing an engine. Things can get hairy really fast during an engine fire.
Now, the Air Force teaches their pilots that if you ever lose an engine in a single-engine aircraft, there are 3 times when you might not want to attempt to restart: fire, FOD, or frozen.
We'll be discussing engine fires in a future video, but if you do have an engine fire, starting the engine back up and sending more fuel up near the fire is a good way to spread the fire to the rest of the aircraft. So, if you lose your engine and you have a reason to believe that the engine is or was on fire, starting back up may not be a good idea. Foreign object damage, or FOD, is another reason why you may not want to attempt a restart. Let's say we're flying around and a foreign object like a bird flew into my engine and that caused it to stop. Chances are, if the engine was stopped by the bird, she ain't starting back up. Take this one with a grain of salt though. If I'm flying in an area like Alaska where first responders aren't going to be able to get to me easily, I'm going to try to restart the engine and get myself closer to civilization. Now, the other time that you might not want to attempt a restart is when the engine is frozen. Frozen engines could be caused by FOD, like the bird we just mentioned, or maybe you forgot to put oil in the engine and then boom, that motor's toast. And now she ain't budging. In this case, your prop is definitely not going to be windmilling, and that's why some people won't even attempt to restart if the propeller is stopped. Once again, you're going to be the pilot in command, so if you're in a bad spot and you feel like you want to attempt to restart if the engine is frozen, you can still run through your emergency start checklist and attempt a restart. But just remember, if your propeller is not spinning, in this situation, you will have to engage the starter and turn the engine that way instead. Okay, let's go back to our checklist, and remember, all we're doing here is making sure everything is set properly so the engine will run. That's why turning the carb heat on is the first step in my checklist. In fact, this is my personal checklist. The items you see here might be in a slightly different order than some of the Cessna 172 emergency start checklists that you're used to seeing. That's because I believe that carb heat should be a priority because it's a very common culprit when it comes to engine problems. And then I like to use an L-shaped flow in the Cessna 172, and that's because it keeps me from missing any steps in the checklist when I'm trying to knock it out quickly. After turning the carb heat on, make sure everyone has their seatbelts on. Even if no one's with me, I still say this step out loud because I want to build a good habit pattern in case I ever do lose an engine. And you definitely want everyone to be buckled properly if you lose an engine for real. Next, I make sure that the fuel selector valve is on both. In some planes like Cherokees, they don't have a both setting. In this case, switch over to the other tank. Maybe you got a bad batch of gas or something, or maybe you ran out one of the tanks because you had your head up your rear end. Either way, it is possible that you ran out of fuel. It happens all the time. And if one of your tanks is empty on the old 172 for some reason, you might consider running only on the tank with fuel. Next, make sure your mixture is full rich. If you lean the mixture too much, this can kill the engine. Go full rich and see if this fixes the problem. Then make sure your ignition switch is on both. Once again, if the prop is stopped, you can attempt to start the engine by engaging the starter. Just remember what we talked about. Then last but not least, make sure the primer is in and locked. If it's not, your engine might not be able to get fuel. You gotta have fuel to run.
I know, there's a lot there, isn't there? But when we go out to the airplane, I think you're going to be shocked at how quickly we can get through this emergency start checklist. But now that you know all this stuff, it's going to be a lot easier to make quick decisions which can save your life if this ever happens to you.
Keep in mind, we're still not done with this emergency. And in just a minute, we'll discuss what you should do when you actually make the emergency landing. But remember what we talked about earlier. There will be times when you can't finish this checklist. That's fine. I couldn't care less if you don't finish this checklist. Get the airplane safely on the ground. But if you do have time, the next step is the D in our ABCs. Declare the emergency. Start by squawking 7700 on your transponder. Even if you can't make a radio call, if you can get 7700 into your transponder while you're still in the air, this can catch ATC's attention so they can get emergency services headed towards your location. Then you can say those 3 words you've always wanted to say on the radio for some strange reason.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
Fun fact for you, apparently Mayday is slang for the French word m'aider, which means help me. So when you say Mayday on the radio, it's going to catch people's attention. Now, here's something important to remember. If you've already been talking to ATC because you're on flight following or if you're on an IFR clearance, you do not have to change over to the emergency frequency. Just make your Mayday call over the frequency you're on, and ATC will do what they can to comfort you before you crash. Just kidding. They're going to do what they can for you and get emergency services headed towards your landing spot. If you're not on with ATC, change your radio over to 121.5 and make your Mayday call over there. In both cases, be as precise as you can with your location, give a brief synopsis of your problem, and tell them how many souls you have on board and where you intend to land. Now, sometimes during an emergency, it's beneficial to tell them how much fuel you have on board, but no one really cares about that if your engine isn't running in a single-engine aircraft. Okay, here's an example of how I might make this radio call.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. Skyhawk 314 at X-ray. 2 souls on board. We lost our engine and we're landing in a field south of Zero Lake.
Now, there's a good chance that someone's going to come back to you on the radio. Answer those guys if you can, but make sure landing safely is your priority. Forget those guys if you get overwhelmed.
Okay, so when we make these landings, there's a few more things we need to do. First, once we know that we're going to make our landing spot, we need to transition to our landing speed. Keep in mind, if you weren't able to lower the flaps because you're trying to maximize your gliding distance, you want to land a little faster so you don't stall the aircraft. Now, during your training, you're not actually going to do these next steps, but you need to be saying them out loud so the examiner knows that you're thinking about them as you continue towards your landing spot. In a real engine out scenario, we want to turn off all the fuel. That way there's no chance of a fire if the landing doesn't turn out the greatest. We also don't want the engine to come roaring back to life at 10 feet above the ground and then crash into something because we weren't expecting that. So we want to make sure the ignition system is off as well. Now, I've heard some instructors teach that you should wait until you're at least 1,000 feet AGL before you start shutting all this stuff down. And the reason for this is to give your aircraft the best possible chance for a restart. That's probably not a bad idea, but if I've been floating down for quite a while and the engine isn't restarting, I'm just going to go ahead and secure the engine. There's nothing that says you need to wait until 1,000 feet. Another important thing that we want to do is to make sure that we unlatch the doors before we touch down. And we do this in case we have a hard landing. Sometimes the door frame can get damaged, and this can keep the door from opening when you need it the most. And if you need to egress the aircraft during an emergency, the doors are by far the best place to exit the aircraft, even though there are several options during a real emergency. Now, you probably noticed that I skipped over the master switch here, and I did that on purpose. As you can see, most emergency landing checklists want you to turn the master switch off, and that just reduces your chance for an electrical fire. Keep in mind, if you turn the master off, you're going to lose your radios, your transponder, and on most Cessna 172s, you're going to lose your flaps. I know that's not a big deal, but it's just something to consider. My rule is that if the landing looks like it's going to be super rough or I'm going to run into something, I'm turning the master off. But if I'll be landing in a nice smooth field or something like that, I'm going to leave it on so I can keep my flaps, my transponder, and the radios. Because during an emergency where I'm the PIC, I'm making the rules because I want the absolute best chance for surviving every situation. From here, we're going to maneuver to land and use flaps and or slip the airplane to get safely on the ground. Now, once again, when you're practicing this maneuver, pay attention to your surroundings. Don't break any rules by getting too close to someone, and don't wait too long to go around. But make sure that you're not cheating yourself by going around too high. Talk with your instructor before you go fly and come up with a good height to go around that's going to maximize your training, but also keep you guys safe.
Okay, in just a minute, I'm going to simulate that I've lost my engine and go through this entire checklist. But don't forget, this is practice, so we need to make sure that we clear the area. So first, let's knock out a couple clearing turns. My controls.
Your controls.
My controls. Clear left.
Your left.
I'm just going to make some quick 90-degree turns. Make sure that nobody's out here. Not going to run into anybody. Not seeing anybody out here. I'm not hearing anybody on the radios.
Yep.
Back to the right.
Should we be on Wasilla radio?
Yep, we're on Wasilla
Okay.
radio. Okay, the moment has finally come to kill this engine and see how simple this maneuver really is. Okay, we're at 3,000 feet. So I do have some kind of cloudy areas over there. We'll just avoid the clouds. Not too worried about that. Alright, so I'm just kind of bebopping around here, and next thing I know, I just lost my engine. So the first thing I want to do is A for airspeed. So I want to pitch for best glide. So best glide in this airplane is somewhere around 70 knots or 80 miles an hour. So I just pitch for that, and then I can trim the airplane. B is best landing spot. Now typically I'm going to go over here towards one of these airfields, but for today's purposes those airfields are pretty busy, and so I'm just going to land out here on this gravel out here in the snow. That seems like a pretty good spot to go towards. We'll avoid all those clouds. B for best landing spot. C for carb heat and checklist. Turn the carb heat on. Now we'll start running the emergency start checklist. Seatbelts on. Make sure you got your seatbelts on. Fuel selector valve on both. I didn't accidentally bump that and turn it to off. Mixture best power. That's full rich. Throttle set. Carb heat's on. I'll go ahead and turn the landing and taxi lights on even though I don't actually need them. Make sure my ignition is on both. And then my master switch is on even though that's not really going to hurt the engine. And then I want to make sure that my primer is in and locked. Alright, so from here I want to continue to pitch towards 70 knots. And I'm looking for a specific landing spot.
Traffic, Cessna 4303 Lima, departing east.
Okay, he's departing to the east, no factor. So now I'm looking for my landing spot. It looked like there's a nice little spot kind of beside that river out there. Actually, we'll kind of land on this side of the river. It looks like there might be some fog that we'll just stay clear of. So basically straight ahead there is what we're shooting for. Now what I want to do is I'd want to squawk 7700. I'd go to 121.5 on my radio, and then I'd make a mayday call. Mayday, mayday. 2 souls on board. We just lost our engine, and we're landing on the Kinnick Arm about 5 miles to the south of Wasilla Airport. Send help. I like cookies. Alright, so from here, now we want to secure the airplane. So we have a rough landing, you know, we don't have an engine fire or something like that. So what we're going to do is, everyone make sure they got their seatbelts on. We would go to fuel selector valve off. Mixture idle cut off. Throttle idle. I could leave the carb heat on. That's really not going to do anything. Then I'd turn my key to off, and then from here we're just going to land straight ahead. Now I'm leaving the master on because that allows me to lower flaps. So you can see like right now I'm lowering the flaps. If ATC were to come back to me, you know, I might want to still talk to them and be like, hey, I think this landing is going to be okay, but like please send somebody out here. It's not going to be very warm out here because it's pretty cold here in Alaska. What is it, 20 degrees today?
It was about 15 to 20, somewhere in there, so and it's colder.
I mean, I have a decent coat, but like I don't want to be out here too long, so please send help. And if I have time, I'll continue to talk to those guys. So now what we want to do is we want to try to shoot for our landing spot. And actually, my landing spot is slightly below us, so I'm going to go ahead and lower those flaps more. And this thing's telling me terrain is ahead. So this is where you have to make a decision. Where do you want to go around? And for training purposes, you may not be allowed to go below 500 feet. Today I've got terrain way off in the distance, so it's not really a factor. So I'm going to go around somewhere around 100 feet above the ground. So I can see dead ahead. There's nothing in front of us, nothing I have to worry about. And if we were to lose our engine in this situation, I'll just land right where we're intending on landing. Okay, so for the go around, I'm going to go ahead and turn the carb heat off. And then we're going to go at full power. I'm going to fight against it and raise that first notch of flaps. Now we'll just truck straight ahead here. And I definitely would have made this giant gravelly area. So now we're looking for a positive rate of climb. There's a positive rate of climb. Second notch of flaps. Positive rate of climb in 70. Flaps up. And we survived that situation. Not too bad. Terrain, we're well clear of the terrain, no factor there. Hey, thank you guys so much for joining me today on Free Pilot Training. Now I've got a question for you. How will you actually know if you have lost your engine? It's actually a lot more difficult than you might think to recognize when you've lost your engine. And me and my friend Seth Lake actually made a video that I think you're going to find shocking and helpful when it comes to that topic. You can watch that video right here. But be sure to smash that like button for me before you head over there. See ya.